Hello and welcome to Small Seeds. We are in the last moments of spring and summer is so close, which means the roses are blooming. Yay! Just the sight of a rose in bloom brings me immense joy. Smelling one brings a whole other level of satisfaction, and then being able to harvest them and create products that make my skin feel soft and smooth like rose petals is a total win. Being able to grow roses in the garden over the past few years has enabled me to create many lovely skincare products. Now, as much as I love my garden roses and find all different species and varieties of roses enchanting, every time I come across a wild rose just growing as it does and as it has for a long time on our lovely garden planet, it always feels significant. They may not be as large or extravagant as some of their cultivated counterparts, but humankind has a long history of utilizing these wild roses for food, medicine, beauty products, and they have long been a representation of love, and in many cultures they were sacred symbols of divinity. Though modern garden roses have become bigger with more petals after thousands of years of selective breeding, even the biggest, showiest roses come from humble beginnings, and their roots all go back to the original species of wild roses. In botanical terms, wild roses are referred to as species roses. There are about 200 species roses which grow wild throughout the world and are found mostly in temperate regions. There are about 20 native rose species in North America, and where I live I have only come across one native species, which I have used sparingly in the past for herbal preparations. 2 years ago, I made one of my absolute favorite herbal syrups with these wild roses, mixed with elderflowers, and produced a delicious summertime herbal soda. Lately, when it comes to these native roses, I have just been trying to admire them while passing by instead of harvesting even small amounts, especially now that we've been adding more roses to our gardens. Plus, there is one wild rose in particular that grows so vigorously around here that it happens to be one of the most invasive species we have in this area. This is the Japanese multiflora rose. Even though it may not be native to North America, multiflora rose is a true species rose which is native to China, Korea, and Japan. It was brought to America in the late 1800s to be used as a rootstock for garden roses, to be planted for fence rows and create wildlife habitat. Unfortunately, it became extremely invasive to the point where it is now classified as a Class B noxious weed in the state of Pennsylvania and a noxious weed in many other states as well. The small white roses bloom in late spring and early summer with multiple flowers on each stem, hence the name multiflora rose. These little white roses form into some of the smallest hips found on any rose species, and they ripen in fall. On this channel, we have mentioned multiflora rose in a few videos, especially when speaking of the small, bright, red edible hips. It is edible invasive plants like the multiflora rose that I believe are perfect candidates to be foraged and wildcrafted, because these are the ones that we can harvest plenty from guilt-free. Now, even though the title and content of this video mostly has to do with harvesting wild roses, you could of course harvest any type of rose, whether it is a wild or cultivated variety. Just keep in mind that if the roses are from a yard, garden, or wild area, you want to make sure that they haven't been sprayed with any chemical pesticides or herbicides. Also, if you plan on harvesting wild roses that may not be as abundant, please do so sparingly, or try to find another species that is more abundant. And if you do harvest from a native or other beneficial rose species, there is a really useful trick to harvesting them that still allows the flower to eventually mature into rosehips. As you can see here, this flower was pollinated by this bee, and by only harvesting petals, this will still give the rose a chance to form a hip, especially since the flower had already been pollinated. All you do is gently pull off the petals, leaving behind the center of the flower, which contains the reproductive organs of the plant. This can be done with any rose and is especially helpful when you are harvesting native or other beneficial species of roses. It's also nice because you can later come back and harvest some of the hips. Now, what if the flower wasn't yet pollinated? Bright, colorful petals on flowers are usually what draw bees and pollinators in, so another great idea would be to leave a petal or two behind. Rosa rugosa is another species rose, and like multiflora rose, it is native to northern China, Korea, and Japan. It can be invasive in many coastal regions, but here in Pennsylvania, I can grow it in my garden without any threat of it escaping and becoming invasive. I truly love Rosa rugosa because I utilize the large hips and lovely fragrant flowers in my home apothecary. When harvesting roses, it is best to look for flowers that have just opened up. This is when they will have the best aroma as well as medicinal content. The petals will look fresh without any wilting, and the centers will contain stamens and anthers that are still bright orange or yellow in color with fresh pollen. The more fragrant a rose is, the better flavor it will have when preparing it into teas, syrups, infused honey, and other edible preparations that you use petals in. And of course, before harvesting any wild plant material, one must have a positive identification. So let's talk a bit about some of the basics when it comes to identifying wild roses. The information in this video on identifying wild roses is pretty generalized since wild roses do differ from species to species, but there are a few common characteristics to look out for. Most wild rose species don't look much like their cultivated counterparts when it comes to the flowers. Cultivated varieties have been selectively bred for centuries for large blooms and numerous petals. When it comes to wild species roses, almost all of them only contain 5 petals. The petals are most commonly oval or heart-shaped, and most commonly pink in color, while white, red, and yellow wild roses are much less common. Many species roses will only bloom once a year in late spring or early summer, with the exception of some species that will continuously bloom throughout the spring and summer like Rosa rugosa. Wild species roses are usually quite fragrant. However, the multiflora roses I am harvesting here have little to no fragrance. The leaves of roses are pinnately compound with an odd number of leaflets. The leaflets are ovate and serrated around the edges, and the leaflets grow in opposite pairs along the leaf stem with one single leaflet at the tip. Depending on the species, each leaf will contain anywhere from 3 to 9 leaflets on each leaf stem, and the leaves themselves grow along the main stems in an alternate pattern. At the base of each leaf stem, where they connect to the main stems, is a stipule. The stipule of native roses in the US are not hairy, while the stipules of the multiflora rose is. The amount of thorns found on roses also vary from species to species. However, you will almost always have some type of thorns, whether they are more bristly, large and curved, or thin and straight. Some rose species grow as small bushes, while others, like the multiflora rose, will grow long, rambling vines that can reach a height of up to 20 feet. Wild roses are most commonly found growing along the edges of forests and along the pathways in forests, in open fields, hedgerows, and thickets. And though I end up harvesting most of the time without gloves, I should absolutely recommend using gloves to you all. Even when I am being careful, I still manage to get pricked by the thorns. Almost all rose species are native to Asia, Europe, North America, and Northern Africa. For millennia, roses have been used for healing and beautifying the skin, for coughs and colds, digestive issues, and they have also been used to heal emotional pain and lift the spirits. Now, I know a simple rose isn't going to take away all of your problems, but stopping to smell the roses and admire their beauty has never failed to lift my mood. And I swear that when I smell a rose, it really does feel like it goes straight to the heart. The petals and leaves contain tannins, giving them an astringent effect, which makes them great externally for toning the skin and internally for digestive complaints. Rose petals also contain vitamin C, have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects, so this mix of benefits is just perfect for the skin. After harvesting the multiflora roses last year, I air dried most of them in my drying rack, which took about 1 week. I ended up keeping some of the leaves with them because they too have beneficial properties, and honestly, I just didn't feel like separating all of the petals from the green parts of the plant material. The astringency and flavor of the leaves gave it a resemblance to green tea. Now, this particular species doesn't produce very fragrant flowers, so there wasn't much of a floral or rosy flavor there either. I wanted to taste it alone to see what it was like, and it wasn't that great, but it wasn't bad by any means. So I think adding other herbs to this tea would be ideal. After trying it and not liking it too much, I ended up adding some lemon balm, lemon, and honey to it and made it into an iced drink, which turned out to be very lovely. Now, multiflora rose may not be very aromatic or colorful, but I do know that when I pop one of these little roses into my mouth, the astringency is definitely there. So the benefits are there when it comes to astringency for sure, but because of the lack of color and scent, I decided I would add some other rosy products to the mix for a little sensory kick. First, I knew I wanted to add these roses to a homemade facial toner. I love using toners every night before bed, and sometimes in the morning when I wake up. I knew I was going to infuse them into witch hazel, since it is already a great toner for the skin. I decided to add in some dried elderflowers because they too have been traditionally used for beautifying the skin, and I think elderflowers and rose petals just go so well together. I also ended up adding some pink and red rose petals that I had dehydrated from our garden, and some hibiscus to add even more benefits and a beautiful rosy color, which after infusing for just 1 hour, I could see the beautiful color coming through. Once it was finished, I strained the flowers from the infused witch hazel, bottled them into these lovely rose-colored spray bottles, and added a couple drops of rose otto oil in each bottle for some extra rosy goodness. For the rest of my dried wild roses, I decided I was going to infuse them in oil using the alcohol intermediary method. I only used some of the dried multiflora rose petals and again mixed them with these deep red petals I had from some of our garden roses. Like I said, I used the alcohol intermediary method for this oil, which we do have a video about on this channel. I ended up infusing the petals into rosehip seed oil and some apricot kernel oil. And once this oil was finished infusing and I strained it, I ended up adding in a few drops of the rose oil like I did with the facial toner, which gave both of these products such a nice rosy scent. Since making these creations last summer, I feel like I have perfected them over the winter months. I managed to harvest and dry many rose petals and rose hips from our garden, and made both the rose facial toner and the oil again, which I gave as Christmas presents, and they definitely turned out even better than the first time I made them last summer. I am actually still using the last of mine and cherishing every drop until I make some more. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you are all enjoying these last days of spring and get the opportunity to take some time to stop and smell the roses. Thank you so much for watching. See you again soon.